Age 7, taken from your family, 14 years of training ahead. They didn't tell you about the weight, 60 pounds of steel, every step, twice the energy. Every battle, your protection becomes your prison. They didn't tell you about the code. Don't burn houses, don't beat priests, don't murder innocents. Rules for violent men playing at honor. They didn't tell you about Agincourt, mud sucking at your feet, arrows falling like rain, French knights dying by the thousands, not from English swords, but from their own armor, too exhausted to fight, too heavy to run. They didn't tell you the truth. Knights spent 40 days a year fighting, the rest waiting, managing land, drinking to avoid poisoned water. The fairy tale was a lie. What happened when boys became knights? Let's find out. You couldn't just decide to become a knight. First, you needed to be born into nobility. Knights were overwhelmingly the sons of knights or lords. Yes, occasionally a commoner might be knighted on the battlefield for exceptional bravery, but that was rare. The biggest barrier was money. A full suit of armor in the 15th century could cost a quarter of a knight's annual income. A reliable war horse could eat up an entire year's earnings. If your family couldn't afford it, knighthood wasn't happening. For those who could, the journey began at age 7. Boys left their families and were sent to live in the household of another knight or noble lord. These young boys became pages, essentially child servants learning the basics. As a page, you'd help your lord dress, serve food at meals, care for his belongings, but you were also learning. Pages received education from priests, learning to read and write. They studied religion. They learned manners and started physical training, riding horses, practicing with wooden swords, going hunting. Around age 14 or 15, if you'd performed well, you'd be promoted to squire. This was when things got serious. As a squire, you became the personal assistant to a knight. You'd care for his horses, clean his armor and weapons, help him dress for battle. You'd accompany him everywhere, to tournaments, into battle, on journeys. But being a squire wasn't just service. The training intensified dramatically. Squires practiced with real weapons now, learning swordsmanship through countless drilling. They'd strike at wooden posts called pels. They'd practice with the quinton, a rotating target that would knock you off your horse if you hit it wrong with your lance. Horseback riding went from basic skill to absolute mastery. This went on for years. Most squires served for about 6 or 7 years until they reached age 21. But there was no guarantee of knighthood. You needed your own armor and weapons before you could be knighted. Some squires never made it. For those who did, the dubbing ceremony was elaborate. The night before, the squire would take a ritual bath. He'd be dressed in special clothing, white for purity, sometimes red for nobility, black for death. Then he'd spend the entire night in prayer at the chapel. No sleep, just prayer and reflection. In the morning came the ceremony. A mass was held with a sermon about knightly duties. The squire's blessed sword would be presented. Then he'd kneel before the knight or lord conducting the ceremony. This person would tap the squire on the shoulder with his hand or sword, saying, "I dub you knight." The new knight would receive his sword and riding spurs. After that came celebration, feasting, music, dancing, sometimes tournaments the next day. It was triumph after years of work. Here's something surprising. Knights only owed about 40 days of military service per year to their lord. That's it. The rest of the year, they were on call, ready if summoned, but mostly managing their own affairs. Knights started each day with morning mass. Religion wasn't optional. Medieval Europe was overwhelmingly Catholic, and everyone, especially those in authority, was expected to fulfill religious duties. Morning prayer was how you began the day. After Mass came breakfast, then the day's work. For knights who held land, which most did, a huge amount of time went to managing it. They oversaw crops, livestock, mills, bakeries. This was crucial because knights needed significant income to maintain their lifestyle. Training took up time too. Knights practiced regularly, swordsmanship drills, riding exercises, practicing with lances. Some knights trained while wearing full armor. There's a famous French knight named Jean II Le Mangre who could perform somersaults in full armor and run for miles while wearing it. That required constant work. Knights also had administrative duties. They might advise their lord on military or political matters. They'd witness documents. Some served as judges or handled disputes between peasants. They might act as messengers or ambassadors. And when they weren't working, knights hunted. They'd participate in social gatherings, spending evenings listening to minstrels. They'd play chess or backgammon. They'd court women. It wasn't an easy life, but for much of the year, it wasn't particularly dangerous either. Medieval knights ate well compared to common people. Their status meant access to food that peasants couldn't afford. The medieval diet was heavy on meat and bread, beef, mutton, pork, game birds. Meat was expensive, demonstrating wealth. Interestingly, vegetables were often viewed with suspicion. There was a saying, "Beware of green salads and raw fruits, for they will make your master sick." Whatever the reason, vegetables weren't fashionable. Meat and bread dominated. Food had to be preserved without refrigeration. Salt and pickling were common. This made food very salty, which made people thirsty. And here's where things get interesting. Clean water wasn't reliably available. So what did they drink? Alcohol, beer, ale, wine, mead. Medieval people drank alcohol throughout the day because it was safer than water. Knights drank a lot. This wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about staying hydrated with something safe. But all that drinking did lead to problems: rowdy behavior, violence. The combination of armed warriors and constant alcohol was trouble, which is partly why the code of chivalry existed. Even fashion was regulated by law. Sumptuary laws restricted what people could wear based on social class. Peasants were forbidden from spending too much on clothing. This ensured noble people like knights could always be identified by their appearance. Knights wore elaborate designs and nicer materials. When most people hear chivalry, they think of politeness. That's not what the medieval code was about. Chivalry was a set of rules designed to keep violent, heavily armed men from destroying society. It was damage control. The code had positive rules: live with honor, be brave in battle, protect the weak, especially women, children, and the church, show loyalty to your lord, maintain your faith, practice generosity and justice. But the more telling part was what it prohibited. Knights were specifically told not to beat up priests, not to steal livestock, not to burn down houses, not to rob, kidnap, or kill random innocent people, not to assault women. The fact that these things needed to be forbidden tells you what knights were actually doing. The code attempted to channel violence in acceptable directions. Fight for your lord, defend Christendom, protect the helpless, but don't terrorize locals, don't destroy the economy, don't undermine the church. It was practical, making sure knights remained assets rather than liabilities. How well did it work? That varied. Some knights genuinely tried to live up to the ideal, others ignored it. The code was enforced through social pressure and reputation, but enforcement was inconsistent. The religious component grew stronger over time, especially during the Crusades. Some knights joined military orders, like the Knights Templar or Hospitallers, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience alongside military duties. This is what knights trained for: war. When the call came, knights reported with their equipment and often additional soldiers. They'd ride to war as heavy cavalry, the elite shock troops of medieval armies. The sight of armoured knights charging at full gallop was terrifying. If you were infantry in their path, your best hope was a tight formation to blunt the impact. But let's talk about that armour. A full suit typically weighed between 45 and 55 pounds. Recent studies found that men in armour used more than twice the energy walking compared to unarmoured walking. Running in armour took nearly twice the energy. This meant armoured knights moved significantly slower and tired faster. In the right conditions, on flat ground, this didn't matter much. Knights could execute devastating charges, but in wrong conditions, armour could be deadly. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, heavily armoured French knights advanced across a muddy field. The mud sucked at their feet. The armour's weight became unbearable. English longbowmen rained arrows down. When they reached English lines, the French were so exhausted they could barely fight. Thousands died. The armour that should have protected them became a death trap. Combat was brutal and chaotic. Medieval battles weren't organised duels. They were confused melees where men hacked at each other in close quarters. Knights fought with swords, lances, maces, warhammers, axes. They aimed for weak points in armour. If knocked off his horse, a knight became vulnerable. Armour did provide real protection. It could deflect sword blows, stop arrows, absorb impacts, but it wasn't invincible. Maces and warhammers could crush armour. Crossbow bolts and later firearms could penetrate it. The goal in combat between knights was often capture rather than killing. A captured knight could be held for ransom, which was more profitable. This created an interesting dynamic where knights might show restraint toward each other while showing none toward common soldiers. Being a knight was incredibly expensive. You needed multiple horses, weapons, servants, equipment. The financial burden was immense. This is why the knight service system existed. Knights received land from their lord in exchange for military service. Income from that land covered the costs. But as warfare changed and costs increased, this system came under strain. The decline of knighthood as a military force began in the 14th and 15th centuries. Longbows and crossbows proved devastatingly effective against armoured knights. The English longbow could punch through armour at range. Infantry tactics evolved to counter cavalry charges. Tight formations of pikemen could stop a charge cold. Then came gunpowder. Early firearms were powerful enough to penetrate armour. As guns improved, armour had to get thicker and heavier. This made knights even less mobile. Eventually, the cost and weight exceeded what was practical. By the 16th century, full-plate armour was becoming ceremonial rather than practical. The nature of warfare had changed. Armies relied on large formations of professional infantry supported by artillery. The armoured knight on horseback had become obsolete. Knighthood itself didn't disappear. It transformed into a title of honour rather than a military role. The romantic ideal lived on in literature, even as the reality faded from battlefields. Being a knight during medieval times wasn't the adventure story we imagine. It was years of training from childhood. It was 40 days of military service and the rest managing land. It was heavy armour that could save or doom you. It was a code designed to keep violent men in check. But knights shaped medieval society in ways that still echo today. If this look into actual knight life gave you a new perspective, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that cuts through the myths. Thanks for watching.